So today we'll be talking about Chapter 15, Section 2, and this is called The Challenges of Urbanization. Urbanization means the rapid growth of cities. And since cities were growing so rapidly, especially in the Northeast, there are some basic concerns that have to be addressed. These are problems like housing. Where are we going to put all these people? Transportation. I mean, one of the great things I love about living in a rural area is traffic's not so bad, but as our county grows in population, traffic does get more of a concern. Water. We take for granted that we can go to the water fountain or the restroom and access clean drinking water. We really do take that for granted, and I hope by understanding some of the gross necessities of life without clean drinking water will make us appreciate what we have a little better. Because when we get into sanitation, yeah, it's going to get gross. Just a little warning for you. I wanted to start with a picture of a city. In fact, this is today the second largest city on the planet. Does anybody know what city this is?
LA.
LA's in the top 10, but it's not the second biggest. Certainly not the biggest. Anybody? Not Chicago. Not New York. What do you think?
Here in America.
Maybe it's a surprise to you. This is Mexico City, in fact. The second largest city in the world. The largest city in the world is Cairo. But yeah, that's Mexico City. So, industrialization, that is mass consumption of products made in factories rather than at home, leads to urbanization because industries tend to pay better than your average job, certainly better than farms. And people flock to these jobs because of a chance for a better life. And most of these industries locate near cities for several reasons. Number one, a reliable market base. There's lots of people there to buy their products. Number two, reliable transportation infrastructure. Cities tend to be located near water or near major railways, near thoroughfares where they can move their product. And then finally, industries like to locate near sources of cheap labor, which are going to be large population centers. Many immigrants are moving into cities for a number of reasons as well, because that's where the jobs are, that's where they can find cheap housing, and that's also where their best chances of meeting other immigrants of common ethnicities are going to be. You know, if I'm an Asian American, I can move to a larger city in the Northeast, and I can find a large community of other Asian Americans. Well, there was a large movement going on in the latter half of the 1800s. It was called the Americanization Movement. It was a movement to assimilate people into the main culture, meaning that when you come here from another place, of course we talked about those immediate concerns of finding a job, shelter, food, safety, comfort, etc. But there's also the long-term concerns of learning the language, of becoming a citizen, of incorporating yourself into the culture that you have moved into. And so schools began ESL programs. Voluntary groups, churches, community centers began to teach citizenship skills, English language, American history, how to cook American dishes even, and also, you know, certain quirks of American culture, etiquette, for example. And ethnic communities of other immigrants are the primary support base for many people moving into this country.
Grandfather, I never knew so many people came to America from so many countries. I'm wondering, how did they all get there in those early days? Also, where did they all live? Did they...
Dear granddaughter, when I came to America, I was able to fly on a plane, but in those early days, people had to come by boats. First, there were sailing ships. Then around the turn of the century, steamships were used. When heading to New York, immigrants traveled across the Atlantic on a ship for 3 weeks in crowded below-deck quarters called steerage. They ate black bread, boiled potatoes, and water soup. As the immigrants sailed into New York Harbor, they sailed past the Statue of Liberty on their way to Ellis Island. When the immigrants saw the Statue of Liberty, they knew they had arrived in the United States. Once the immigrants reach the United States, they usually have to wait on board the ship for days because the immigration station was so crowded. Everybody coming to America had to check in at an immigration station before they were allowed to live here. This is where they kept track of everyone entering the country. But not everyone who came to America got to stay. If an immigrant was sick, he or she might be forced to go back to his or her country. In 1892, Ellis Island welcomed 17 million people to America. On the West Coast, immigrants usually landed at the Angel Island Immigration Station in San Francisco Bay. Millions of these arriving immigrants stay in the cities where they landed. On the East Coast, that was New York City. For most immigrants, these cities were a whole new world. New York was like no other place they had ever seen. Many immigrants had lived on small farms in Europe and had hoped to buy land in the United States, but very few could afford to do that. So they often settled into crowded neighborhoods. A lot of immigrants live with relatives or friends in poorly built apartments called tenements. Tenement life was a hard one. 5 to 6 people would have to sleep in one tiny room. It was dark and stuffy, with too few windows for light or air. The streets outside were always noisy and dirty. Most immigrants worked long hours with little pay. As a matter of fact, wages were so low that everyone in the family, even young children, had to work. This was just to earn enough money for food. Factory businesses were growing and crowded with workers. Women and even children worked in factories. The cities in the Northeast eventually grew much larger and more crowded because of the great many immigrants who wanted to settle there. But even with those difficulties, immigrants were determined to make a life for themselves here. One way the immigrants were able to cope with these difficulties was to form communities based on the various ethnic groups. An ethnic group is a group of people from the same country, people of the same race, or people with a common way of life. These ethnic communities or neighborhoods could be found in just about every area of the United States. New York City is packed with neighborhoods based on ethnic communities. Many Italian families settle in a New York neighborhood called Little Italy. There are the traditional outdoor cafes here, as well as stores that sell Italian products, everything that reflects their culture back home. The largest Chinese population in the United States live in Chinatown, which is in San Francisco. Los Angeles' largest ethnic community is a Latin American neighborhood located in East Los Angeles. These Latin American neighborhoods were known as barrios. A barrio is a neighborhood of Spanish-speaking people, and many of the people in these barrios are from Mexico and Central and South America, or are the children or grandchildren of these immigrants. Like most other new immigrants to the United States, few Mexicans spoke English or knew people here. Just to be able to talk with people in their own language make them feel more at home.
Now, as farm technology increased, farms no longer needed massive labor forces. Cotton can be harvested mechanically. Corn can be harvested with a giant tractor. And no longer do you need these huge labor forces on plantations. And so many people's jobs were replaced by machines. And they began to move to cities because that's where the jobs were at that time. Many African Americans in the South were these laborers affected by mechanization. And many of them began to move to the North, and particularly to move to cities. And while discrimination in the South is legendary, discrimination in the North existed as well. And often it was in the form of job competition, because many people resented new people moving into the area who provided a cheap source of labor. And so this created tension. In fact, many of the labor movements that we talked about a few days ago refused entry for African Americans or immigrants in some cases. But let's talk about some basic concerns for rapidly growing cities. One of these is transportation. Many people who live in large cities today don't even bother to purchase a car. I know that's something you're looking forward to, and in a rural area it's a very practical thing to own your own car. Yet in a large city it may not be practical because there is not space to put your car. Traffic is a nightmare in some large cities. And so mass transit is how many people get around in large cities. Mass transit means my aunt every day in Chicago rides an L to work. It's an elevated train. It's kind of cool. I've ridden it with her before when I was a kid and went up to visit. She rides that every day to work. And then from there she gets onto a bus that finally takes her to her destination. She doesn't even drive to work. Now she lives outside the city. They do own a car to get to soccer matches and things, but otherwise she relies on mass transit. But of course, if we're talking about the late 1800s, mass transit in a city, well, it's rather limited, right? Horsepower. But next, housing. Where are people going to live? A very practical concern. Working class families wind up living in houses on the outskirts of cities, or often even in boarding houses, living in temporary dwellings. Immigrants would often have to double up. Anybody who didn't have a great job would often have to put 2 or 3 families in a home together to split bills. And these are often called tenements. The textbook definition is multi-family urban dwelling. And this can be tricky. I don't know if you've ever had, maybe you have a really large family and you're used to that already. I had roommates in college. I've even shared a room with up to 8 people for summer trips. It can be challenging, and you have to get used to no privacy. 8 people in one restroom, well, that does require just a bit of sacrifice and patience. It can also be just plain old unsanitary. One person in that room gets sick, everybody gets sick because we all share the same germs. But of course, like I was talking about, mass transit. Mass transit provides the ability for large groups of people to move quickly through a city along fixed routes. If you go on our DC trip next year, you'll get to see the subway. If you have time, you can ride on it perhaps. And while subways were a relatively new phenomenon, and not many cities had them by the early 1900s, there were forms of transit connecting people with suburbs. I'll show you a few early examples in just a moment. Because when you have large numbers of horses in a city, that creates some real concerns. For example, horses obviously poop. Nothing you can do about that. And if you're in a large city, well, street sweeping is not exactly a glamorous job, but somebody has to clean up the poop. Well, if you have a large growing city and more people bringing in horses, well, that's more and more poop. In a poorer place, without the tax base to pay for more street sweepers, you get piles of poop. It got so bad in Memphis, Tennessee, in fact, there was an outbreak of cholera, I believe, associated with mosquitoes that would breed in the poop. So bad they had to burn parts of the city to the ground and rebuild. But this photograph is what's called a dumbbell tenement. It's looking down on it from the roof. A dumbbell tenement means that you have a high-rise, well, for that time, a high-rise apartment building with many, many different families living on different floors. In between these two buildings, you have an alleyway. And another one of the main concerns of a large growing city is sanitation. Because you see, with no running water, for many people that served as where you dump out the bucket, if you get my drift. It's also where you dump much of your trash. People just throw things into the alley, and it's rather disgusting. But next, housing. Where are people going to live? A very practical concern. Working class families wind up living in houses on the outskirts of cities, or often even in boarding houses, living in temporary dwellings. Immigrants would often have to double up. Anybody who didn't have a great job would often have to put 2 or 3 families in a home together to split bills. And these are often called tenements. The textbook definition is multi-family urban dwelling. And this can be tricky. I don't know if you've ever had, maybe you have a really large family and you're used to that already. I had roommates in college. I've even shared a room with up to 8 people for summer trips. It can be challenging, and you have to get used to no privacy. 8 people in one restroom, well, that does require just a bit of sacrifice and patience. It can also be just plain old unsanitary. One person in that room gets sick, everybody gets sick because we all share the same germs. But of course, like I was talking about, mass transit. Mass transit provides the ability for large groups of people to move quickly through a city along fixed routes. If you go on our DC trip next year, you'll get to see the subway. If you have time, you can ride on it perhaps. And while subways were a relatively new phenomenon, and not many cities had them by the early 1900s, there were forms of transit connecting people with suburbs. I'll show you a few early examples in just a moment. Because when you have large numbers of horses in a city, that creates some real concerns. For example, horses obviously poop. Nothing you can do about that. And if you're in a large city, well, street sweeping is not exactly a glamorous job, but somebody has to clean up the poop. Well, if you have a large growing city and more people bringing in horses, well, that's more and more poop. In a poorer place, without the tax base to pay for more street sweepers, you get piles of poop. It got so bad in Memphis, Tennessee, in fact, there was an outbreak of cholera, I believe, associated with mosquitoes that would breed in the poop. So bad they had to burn parts of the city to the ground and rebuild. You see, in the 1860s, many cities have inadequate, or in some cases, no running water. Certainly not in their buildings. Indoor plumbing was a very exclusive luxury. And yet again, it's something we take for granted. Often in large cities, in the late 1800s, you would have to boil the water before you drank it. Filtration wasn't actually introduced at all in cities until 1870. And so without an understanding of bacteriology, people just got sick a lot because they were drinking nasty water. Chlorination. Chlorine is capable of killing many of the really nasty bugs. Wasn't actually introduced in cities until 1908. Again, I got to get gross for a minute with sanitation. The next picture I'm going to show you is rather disturbing. With streets, of course, with horse transportation, you have large piles of manure laying around. Open gutters are essentially ditches on the sides of streets where the water can run off into sewer systems. But without complex sewer systems, these would often back up, creating huge puddles of really disgusting, tepid water. Factories weren't exactly environmentally friendly back then. Most were powered by steam, and that means you're burning large amounts of coal, which puts off tons and tons of smoke. And so cities had a horrible smell to them. I mean, if you lived in a city, you're going to develop respiratory problems from constantly inhaling smoke. Now, contractors could find work sweeping streets, collecting garbage, or cleaning outhouses. It's honest work. It's how I started. It was my first job, was cleaning garbage. And it's tough work. It is. It's nasty work. It's honest work. But with large cities like this, you're talking about a massive undertaking. And really, no cities had sewer lines, that is underground sewage, until 1900. What are we looking at here? Well, so there's some kids playing, as Jade said, by a dead horse. What are they playing in, by the way? That's an open sewer. So it's basically a gutter where rainwater and waste can run off into this gutter and ideally get out of the city eventually. Are the kids wearing shoes? Nope. Yeah, thought I'd point that out. There's standing water. Who knows what's mixed with it? Generally, it's a pretty poor situation. But next, let's talk about crime. See, as populations grew, thieves were able to flourish because early police forces were ineffective. In fact, the original Sherlock Holmes was written in London around this time. And with a lack of forensic evidence, with the quality of detective work rather primitive at that time, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock, based his novel around the principles of deduction, of figuring out, using context, to solve crimes. But I want to tell you the story about a man named Dr. Daniel Holmes. It's a true story of a doctor who was practicing in Chicago as the city was preparing for its great World's Fair in 1900. And the whole city was preparing to host the greatest exhibition on the planet. Cities competed just like they do for the Olympics. Every 10 years, the World's Fair would be held. The previous, in 1890, was held in Paris. And by the way, the Eiffel Tower was built in Paris for the World's Fair. That's how big a deal this thing is. And so Chicago's got to beat the Eiffel Tower. Well, how do we beat the Eiffel Tower? That's known around the world, international symbol of France. How do we beat the Eiffel Tower? Well, the challenge was to build something that had never been done before. And so the Ferris wheel was built for the Great White City, which is where the World's Fair was hosted. Well, at the same time as the construction of this amazing Ferris wheel, And the Buffalo Bill Wild West show was there, and then City threw out all the stops just like they do for the Olympics. There was a doctor who was practicing. He was a very good-looking man. He always hired young women to be his assistants. And he would always take out life insurance policies on them. It was just one of the conditions of the job. But Chase, after a while, these young women would disappear. But no worries. He would always hire women that were unattached. And he would always just claim, well, they moved back with their families. They went back to the countryside in Illinois, whatever, you know. It happens. It's life. And no one ever really followed up. Because who's going to challenge the word of this young, attractive doctor? Well, eventually, an insurance claims adjuster did just that. Because this man had the audacity to cash in on these young women. He was cashing in on these policies and collecting on life insurance policies when he claimed they would get sick and pass or whatever. And eventually this insurance claims adjuster began to do some research. And it was tough to get a warrant because there was really no proof. I mean, he was in good reputation and good standing. But as he continued to dig, he found there was a basement with no clear door. But there was this basement. And occasionally he would see smoke coming out of it. Well, finally he was able to get a warrant. And finally, after several attempts, they were able to discover this basement. There was an autopsy table, and there was a crematorium. You see, he was actually performing experiments on these young women, dissecting them, labeling their anatomy, and publishing his work in medical journals. Because at that time, there was no reliable way to get cadavers to study. And so med students were commonly known to dig up freshly buried corpses. Well, this man had a reliable source of the freshest corpses. And again, he was publishing his work. His work is still, you can find it in American journals. Well, he was brought to trial. He earned the nickname Dr. Death. This is a really creepy case. In fact, the story of this is published. It's a really famous novel called Devil in the White City. And you got to read it. It's really good. And yeah, it's really good, I promise. Now, when he was brought to trial, this man was completely without remorse. In fact, he said, "I've advanced the cause of science, and I have nothing to be ashamed of for what I've done. My work will save lives." And really, who's to miss these young women anyway? I mean, it's just creepy stuff. Well, anyway, the point is he was able to get away with this for over a decade. Because as cities were growing so rapidly, there was no great system for keeping up with who was coming in, who was coming out. And of course, fire hazards. There was also the Great Fire of Chicago. The city once caught on fire, and almost the entire city burned to the ground at one point because many of the building materials, brick and mortar, wood, weren't exactly fire resistant. Many of the sources of heat involved open flame. Fire departments were usually volunteer-based and often poorly equipped. Yet by 1900, most cities do have full-time professional fire departments. Non-flammable building materials do make buildings much safer. I mean, if the worst happened, we had a horrible fire in this room, most of the materials this room is made out of are flame retardant. I mean, the posters would burn. Our clothing could certainly catch on fire. The stuff around the room could burn, but the building itself, well, that would be okay.
The American Industrial Revolution was marked not only by the changing face of American industry, but also by the changing face of America. As mills and factories sprouted across the land, cities grew up around them. In turn, the cities beckoned to workers by the millions from the American countryside and from overseas to fuel the burgeoning industrialization. What was once a rural nation was rapidly becoming an urban state. Between 1860 and 1910, the urban population grew from 6 million to over 44 million. Rural Americans abandoned their farms to take factory jobs in the big cities. Joining them en masse were new immigrants from overseas. By 1870, they were arriving on American shores at a rate of nearly 400,000 per year. By 1882, this number had doubled to 800,000 annually. This tide of urban migration brought with it new social problems. Until 1885, most immigrants were from Northern Europe and Britain. But by the late 1880s, people from Southern and Eastern Europe and Latin America began to disembark from the transcontinental steamships, creating racial and ethnic tensions. Due to increased cultural diversity, the scope of social problems began to grow. These were the landless, the unskilled, and poverty-stricken. The huddled masses that Emma Lazarus reflected upon in her poignant inscription for the Statue of Liberty.
Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door.
The growth of American urban centers was nothing short of astounding. In the 20 years after 1870, the population of Minneapolis grew from 13,000 to 165,000. Denver grew from 4,700 to 107,000. And New York had a population of over 2 million. Chicago and Philadelphia had more than 1 million citizens each, and Baltimore, Boston, and St. Louis were home to nearly 500,000 people. Housing, water, and crucial services such as sanitation, roads, and bridges were woefully inadequate. New tenements sprung up and were immediately overcrowded. Garbage collection efforts and police and fire protection simply could not meet the overwhelming demand for city dwellers. Journalist H.L. Mencken described the stench of 1880s Baltimore like 1 billion polecats. Widespread corruption in the cities was blamed on the immigrants who crowded dilapidated buildings, packed the jails, and voted for the candidates of powerful politicians in return for small favors. In 1900, a local journalist marveled at the capacity people displayed to survive in deplorable conditions. The wonder is that they are not all corrupted, and speedily, by their surroundings. 19th century sociologist William Graham Sumner held the controversial belief the fittest members adapt to the environment and prosper, while weak members do not. For the social Darwinist, these principles of natural selection applied to capitalism. The more prevalent view, championed by the wealthy, including John D. Rockefeller, was that the power to make money is a gift from God. Modern America rose from the foundations laid by men such as Rockefeller. History views them kindly for their contributions. But despite their wealth, they were often reluctant to share the good fortune with their employees. Employees often worked 12 to 18-hour days. Factories were dark, dirty, and dangerous. Working conditions in many factories were shocking. One Massachusetts textile worker compared the animosity between worker and employer to the former feeling of bitterness between the North and the South. While business tycoons risked huge amounts of money to gamble on technological advances and new markets, they were unwilling to share profits with their workers. Their words reflect the expectations of one Massachusetts employer. I regard my work people just as I regard my machines. When my machines get old and useless, I replace them. It's the same with these people. As long as they do the work for what I choose to pay, I get out of them what I can. Many factory machines were run by women and children, some as young as 8 years old. The children, who were paid less than adults, were forced to work the same long hours. This was a typical factory workday for children in the textile factories around 1870. Many families depend on the small incomes of their young children to survive in America. These are the words of Sadie Frown, a 16-year-old sweatshop girl.
Those machines run like mad all day long. Sometimes my finger gets caught and the needle goes through it. If it goes through the nail too, it hurts real bad. But I just tie a rag around it and keep on sewing. Sometimes the finger has to come off. Y'all have accidents like that.
If workers complained, they were quickly replaced with other immigrants eager for the work. These additions planted the seeds for labor reform. The skilled workers, cigar makers, printers, and iron workers began to organize in 1875. Soon after, factory workers also began to unite. They sought to get equal pay for women and shorter workdays. By the end of the decade, union membership reached 300,000. In 1877, pay cuts totaling 20% caused Baltimore and Ohio rail workers to strike. Two-thirds of the nation's rail service was affected. 10 workers in Baltimore were killed in the resulting riots. Another 26 in Pittsburgh died, prompting President Rutherford B. Hayes to call out federal troops, thus ending the strike. These events led to the formation of the Knights of Labor in the 1880s, led by Terence Powderly. This organization worked to improve adverse sweatshop and factory conditions and to outlaw child labor. The Knights were at odds with the more conservative American Federation of Labor, a movement headed by Samuel Gompers. Gompers emerged as leader of labor reform, leading the AFL from 1886 until his death in 1824. By 1900, laws were being passed to improve housing conditions, health, and education for the poor.
So, since cities were often incapable of fixing many of these problems for themselves, many individuals and organizations and private charities stepped in to try to help to relieve urban poverty. For example, the social gospel movement was a nationwide cultural movement which preached that salvation was more than personal edification, but was intended to make people want to help others. There were a number of community centers in poor neighborhoods. These were often called settlement houses. They were often run by college-educated women who would provide educational, cultural, and social services. Of course, there are a number of these today. Our county has a homeless shelter. Our county has a place for abused women to seek refuge and to help them with relocating. These settlement houses, even in the early 1900s, would send visiting nurses to make house calls to sick or shut-in people. And they would also help with personal job and financial programs. In fact, much of our community college exists for that purpose as well. One of the early famous reformers here was Jane Addams, who founded the Hull House with Ellen Gates. And here she is with her students. So anyway, there's Jane Addams, and this is one of the earliest settlement houses.